Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Kaplan, Director of Education at YIVO, and I'm so honored to be here today with Joan Nathan. Joan, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Joan, you're the author of, most recently, King Solomon's Table, and many classic texts like Jewish Cooking in America and the Jewish Holiday Kitchen. Joan, we were supposed to be down in DC this week at the Smithsonian.
Exactly.
Yeah, for the event launching the class, a seat at the table, and said we're here at home in our kitchens doing a lot of cooking. So I'm sure people are curious to know, what have you been cooking lately?
Oh, well, I have been cooking a lot. I'm actually here in New Orleans with my daughter, and I've made a lot of challah from wonderful grains that I've gotten here. Right now, I've been making, yesterday made hummus, and it was really delicious. I haven't made the North Carolina kuchen that I was going to do with the Smithsonian, because we're trying not to eat too many sweets because you're not moving as much as you usually move around.
Right.
I don't know. I've made mujadra. I've made a lot of fish on just fish with lots of different vegetables. It's really been working beautifully, all kinds of things. Orange, ginger chicken, but nothing particularly Ashkenazi yet. I'm very anxious to make, and I told my daughter this, she thought I was nuts, a new soup that I learned, a pickle soup, which is a Polish Yiddish. It's not necessarily Jewish, but it's been made Jewish because Jews have been making it for years and years and years.
Wow.
And it's a pickle juice, vegetable broth, sour cream, kohlrabi, all kinds of vegetables, peas. It's really delicious. I recently had it at a Polish restaurant in LA.
I think we're all always looking for more ways to use our leftover pickles and pickle brine. So it's very Ashkenazi, and that's a great tip.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you were in DC. You were going to talk about Fania Lawando, who wrote the Vilna Vegetarian Cookbook. And for those of you who might not know, Fania Lawando was this wonderful restaurant owner, chef, and cookbook author. And she had a vegetarian restaurant in Vilna, in pre-war Vilna, and she wrote this astonishing cookbook that was rediscovered many years later, and YIVO was involved in publishing it, and Joan, you wrote the foreword for that book. So I'm just curious to ask you, because as people are watching us here, when you read a book like the Vilna Vegetarian Cookbook, what smells, what flavors, what textures come to your mind? Where does your imagination go?
Well, for this particular book, I don't know if you know the story, but I was giving a cooking class at Stone Barns in Westchester County, and the two women that discovered the book showed up. They were from Great Neck, New York, and they came because they knew I was going to be there. And they showed me this manuscript with these amazing seed catalog, colorful seed catalogs as the illustrations. And when I looked at the recipes, many of which none of us knew, just like this pickle soup, which is in the book, and using ingredients like kohlrabi and rhubarb and all these wonderful things that we are rediscovering now that our world does not have as much meat as we thought. It's a very relevant cookbook. Anyway, I saw it, and I always feel that it's just cookbooks that are important that should be, that make a difference, that should be published. So I immediately contacted Shotgun Books and I told them about it, and the rest is history. So I'm fascinated by Fania Lawando. I wish I knew more about her. I know she was born about 1889, and she had this in a way, she was like Alice Waters. You know, she was interested in healthy food, but real food. She had this restaurant in Vilna that was very, very popular. It was a dairy restaurant. It was the heyday of dairy restaurants. But what was so poignant to me was her book came in 1938. And at that time, she was doing things that I used to do. Like I used to be on the Queen Elizabeth going back and forth doing lectures to Europe. And she was doing the same thing, lectures and food on these boats, kosher food on these boats that were going from Gdansk to New York and then back. And she did that before the war. And this was between the wars when her cookbook came out. And there are a lot of Jewish cookbooks that were coming out, incidentally. But it was 2 years after the YIVO cookbook came out for Palestine with all kinds of Ashkenazic food. And it really, in the YIVO cookbook, it talked about going to Palestine where there wasn't a lot of meat. And it was also 3 years after, 1935, they had the laws against kosher meat in Vilna. And I believe Vilnius was the first town because it was considered the Jerusalem of the East. And it was the first town that had these kosher laws against kosher meat. So people had to find different things to use. And so a dairy cookbook was really important. And we would call it a vegetarian cookbook today, but you know, there were dairy meals. This was part of being Jewish. And usually at that time, there would be a lot of dairy coffee shops. But this one was very popular. People like Marc Chagall went there.
Wow.
Today it's in the art district of Vilnius. I was there many, many years ago. I believe her house now is a dentist's office. Her restaurant.
Yeah.
But it was very, very popular. And you know, some of the recipes like the pickle soup or a rhubarb strudel that I love. You know, using pea shoots and pea soup. She clearly knew her vegetables. And although the recipes need some testing and also some thinning out for us, they're really, if you play around with them, they're really terrific.
So there are ones that you mentioned the pickle soup. Any other ones that jump out to your mind that really sort of capture or compel you?
Well, there was a fried cauliflower frittata, the rhubarb blintzes, excuse me, I said strudel, rhubarb blintzes with a rhubarb sauce. That is something I make all the time now. Also a green pea strudel. How does that sound to you? So these are all really wonderful things. And that she didn't use like she might have had a filled apple cake, or you know, she had to have some mandelbrot, but the recipes are different recipes. And that's why I would love to have met her. And these are things that really are the greatness of Ashkenazic cuisine, because, you know, we love babka and we love schnecken and we love rugelach. These are all, you know, Sephardic food has gotten so much of a hype now, but for baked goods and also really good meat dishes, you should go to Ashkenazic food. And, you know, I like cooking in the Mediterranean style, but for desserts, I always will have an Ashkenaz, mostly always will have an Ashkenaz. You know, what can be better than a really good strudel with not the the lekva that you get in the supermarket, but making your own lekva or making your own fillings that combine nuts and dried fruits, which is the way that our great-grandmothers did. Maybe great-grandmothers.
Well, Joan, I would love to be at a dinner table with you and Fania Lawando and to hear the questions that you would ask her.
Oh my God, absolutely. Absolutely. I just, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I wanted to ask you about that because you're writing, you know, you write about Ashkenazi Jewish foodways, but you write about Jewish foodways from around the world. You've covered, I think, everything. And I'm sort of curious how you started to talk about it, where Ashkenazi Jewish food fits into this global Jewish food story.
Well, I would think that it fits in very importantly. First of all, I think of Jewish food as a bagel, like the world, going around the world. And in about the 10th century, all food was Sephardic food, or it wasn't Sephardic, it was Jewish food, Middle Eastern food. And it came up through Italy to France. And you would have, for example, for Passover, you would have romaine lettuce, or you would have something green like maror, which is like arugula, something bitter, a bitter green. You wouldn't have horseradish root. You would use olive oil. You wouldn't use chicken fat. All of this because people lived in the Mediterranean. Then people started going up the Rhine, the Rhone River, excuse me, in France to Alsace-Lorraine, and also through Germany up the Rhine. So that in southern Germany, you started learning about what Ashkenazic food was. So at Passover, there was no more green bitter herbs. 400 miles up in France and in Germany, it was too cold then. So you would have horseradish root as your bitter herb. You'd use schmaltz for your cooking because you weren't gonna, it would be too expensive to, things are gonna become today, trust me, to bring olive oil up to Alsace-Lorraine. And don't forget, that's where Rashi was at that time too. And so you changed what you ate. And meat, there's a lot more meat there, so that meat was more important. They were doing a lot of pickling. So something like choucroute garni became something that Jews would eat on the Sabbath. They were non-Jews writing in about the 13th century, those smelly dishes that the Jews used. It was preserving things, right, for the Sabbath. Why did they use them? And then these became Jewish dishes instead of, let's say, a cholent. Cholent was something Eastern European. Anyway, these foods went eastward. And as they went eastward, they also picked up other dishes as they went along. There was a lot more grain in Russia, or in East, like in France and in Germany. So you would have dishes like, strudel came a different way, but you'd have dishes like a challah, which was like a brioche in many ways.
Sure.
And so you'd have all these dishes, like arugula was shaped really like a croissant. Croissant came a different way, but these things became part of what a schnecken, a babka. These were all things that became Jewish, and then, or gefilte fish. In the Jews in the South could always have fresh fish because there was the Mediterranean there. Gefilte fish was a way of storing the fish, or stretching it to a whole family and adding eggs and onions and breadcrumbs just to stretch it for the Sabbath. And you wouldn't have to work at eating it because it would be made in these little, they would be inside a fish. Originally, gefilte fish meant stuffed fish. So it'd be inside a fish, and then eventually it became little balls that came across the ocean to the United States, where we had them differently. And then, of course, the United States, they've changed gefilte fish even more, to make it into loaves. And so Jewish food, Eastern European Jewish food was very important, and Yiddish food, first in Germany and France, and then east, as it went east when the Poles invited the Jews to come there. It just changed again. And Jewish food has always changed regionally. So there's all kinds of regional Yiddish food. And, I really think that your course is going to show a lot of this. But it makes it so fascinating to study.
No, I'm so glad we have a chance to look at all of that diversity and understand that sometimes those borders are not so clear, especially in cooking and in food ways.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I found a Yiddish dish that I'd never heard of before, and I'm finding it more and more. It was, oh, I forget what it's called. It was called, in Canada, where I first heard about it, it was called blueberry buns.
Mm.
And it was very delicious, and they were sort of oblong, and they were in all kinds of stores in Toronto, and I didn't know the origin of them. So as I was making these buns, rolling them at my house, this young girl, Sarah Weiner, who's the head of what is she the head of? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Sarah Weiner came to my house, and she said, "That's just what my grandmother made."
Wow.
And I'd never heard of anybody who had these blueberry buns before, but she said, "But my grandmother's were better." So I played around with her recipe, and it turns out that the baker in Toronto that made these buns it was before the war, and then she came here after the First World War, and Sarah's grandmother came after the Second World War. And but most of the people died in the Holocaust. So she was able her grandmother saved this recipe, and so did this other woman. And now I'm learning about it all over Poland in a new iteration. And so, it needs to be, you need luck to find a recipe, and you also need a lot of digging to find a recipe. But you should definitely try blueberry buns.
I'm gonna rush to my kitchen right after this and see if I can get them
Calm and stable.
So memory and nostalgia seem to be important ingredients, as you're saying, in Jewish cooking. Are there particular foods you're particularly nostalgic for these days?
Well, I guess I happen to like a good chocolate babka, and I'm in New Orleans, and I haven't seen one yet. And the restaurants are closed. I know that what's it called? Sababa has chocolate babka.
Sure.
At his restaurant, but I haven't had one yet. My mother would make these pastries that were from her grandmother, who was from Krakow, and they were filled with jam, and it was a butter dough. And I still can see my mother making them. You made them like it was sort of like a strudel, but not a strudel. And it was I just can see my mother's hands making this dessert. But it was jam, good jam, and enclosed in dough. And I can also see my mother's hands making my father's Zwetschgenkuchen, which was a blue plum pie that you would make at Rosh Hashanah. And that's one of my favorite dishes in the world. And, there are very few people that make these things anymore, and they're so good. And that's why I like writing my books, because I discover them and I can give them to the next generation.
Well, Joan, I hope you're going to be making more babka and strudel and kuchen in the near future.
I hope so too. And I hope you'll come to my house.
I can't wait. When can I come? Well, when we're all released from home, we'll be on the first plane.
Okay.
So you demonstrate a kuchen recipe in the course, which is fantastic. So people will be able to check that out with you and come into the kitchen with you. You also do a presentation on how to write a Jewish cookbook. So two really wonderful presentations we have from you that we're so grateful to have in this course. I hope everyone will check out A Seat at the Table. We just launched, so it's live now. You can cook with Joan. And Joan, I hope I'll see you soon and eat some babka with you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me, and good luck with the course.
Thank you, Joan. Thanks for joining us.